Okay, so as I promised on Twitter, I have Mad Libs. We're going to do these a little bit differently from the way you might have done Mad Libs, if you've ever done Mad Libs. So first of all, please remember the code of conduct. And secondly, you can make any kind of change you want. Fill in a word, change somebody else's word, cross something out, add something. But on the right-hand side of the sheet, you'll see the number 1 and then my name. And when you make a change, you're going to write an integer that's 1 greater than the last person, and then a dash, and then your name. And then pass it on to the next person and kind of like continue through your section, so maybe everybody will get a chance, although there's a lot of people here tonight. How many of you at some point connected to the internet with a dial-up modem? Oh my goodness, it's everybody. I thought we were a dying breed. So back, my parents were sheep farmers, which is not really relevant to the talk, but back in the 90s when we had a slow internet connection, you could kind of like go online and visit a bunch of pages, and then somebody would yell at you to get off the phone, and you drop the connection, and you could like actually kind of surf this microcosm of the web using your browser history and any followed links, and just using the browser cache as a local storage. And then there was kind of like this golden period in the 2000s where developers, I assume, could kind of assume that anybody using the web and sitting at their computer actually had an internet connection, and you didn't have to worry about the possibility of using the web offline because it didn't really make any sense. And then when the iPhone came around in 2008, the whole idea of network reliability just completely went out the window. And the problem is that in that intervening period was when Facebook came along and Rails was first released, and Google started making Gmail and Maps and whatever, Google Reader. And then the web went from being like this thing you just read to this thing you could kind of interact with. And so just being able to use a cache or a local storage as a strategy for making something work offline wasn't really possible anymore. And so that's sort of what we've been dealing with for the past few years. So just a quick outline. I'm going to give a bit of an introduction, defining offline first, how I think about it, talk about a couple of my favorite technologies for managing this problem, PouchDB and CouchDB. I will show a demo, as I always do, of a working text editor. And then just to prove that this is not something you can only use to build toy apps, I'll also show a real-world example that I'm actually working on in my day job, too. So first of all, if you have an existing app and you want to add offline capability, at first glance, that doesn't seem too difficult. You have your sort of standard architecture where a browser is talking to a server over HTTP, and the server is writing to a database. And you could just save some data locally as well. We've had IndexedDB, I believe it was actually in IE10, so it's been around for quite a while. And it works as a local storage repository. But when you're talking about interacting with applications and not merely reading from them, hopefully it's clear that this pretty quickly gets pretty complicated. So what do we do with server requests while we're offline? Well, we could store the data locally and send it later. But when the request is intended to modify the database state, then you have this problem of what happens when the database state changes in the meantime. And usually an HTTP request is like a transactional request to modify something. It's not a full copy of all of the data. And so the question is, when is it still valid if another user's modifying the same data or the same user's doing it on another device? And so a superior mental model and maybe architecture comes from the CouchDB world. And so what we're doing here is storing all of the user's data or a local database representing everything they might want to interact with on their own machine. They can modify it as much as they like, whether or not they're online. And then when the network connection does become available, that data syncs with the cloud, the remote database, the server, whatever you want to call it, which, don't get me wrong, that's still a really hard problem. Syncing is not a simple thing to think about programmatically, but it has already been solved to a satisfactory degree. And the reason that it's been solved is because of those lines connecting the different remote database nodes together. So I'm probably like the worst person in this room to talk about this, but there's this thing called the Pac Theorem, which basically states that if you partition a database between different servers, you can have all of those servers available anytime if you tolerate some amount of inconsistency between the data whenever you make a read. So the Couch database technology, which is maintained by Apache, is based on this principle. It tolerates temporary local inconsistency between the data with the faith, I guess, that eventually we'll be able to get back to consistency of any individual document. Okay, so what actually is CouchDB? It's a database management system built for replication across unreliable networks, just more or less what I was just talking about, and it tolerates temporary inconsistency between that data. I'll talk more later about how it manages conflicts and how you can manage them as a front-end developer even. But the other thing that's really, really nice about CouchDB is that it uses HTTP as its primary interface. If you install a Couch server on your own computer and you want to get documents or write to documents, primarily you're doing that using curl commands. And it uses that interface both for those sort of normal CRUD operations, as I was just talking about, as well as syncing. And that's really powerful for a database we're using primarily on the web. And it means that a version of this, which is running in your browser, can sync with a remote version just over the browser's normal HTTP protocols. Okay, so what is PouchDB? PouchDB is essentially the browser version of Couch. It's just a unified JavaScript interface for different databases. When you're running it in a browser, it's usually using IndexedDB, which is that same browser-based local storage that I was talking about before. But it can also act as an interface if a remote connection is available for Couch, as well as other things that you might use in a testing environment or something like that. So it's kind of like jQuery to the native DOM. You don't really want to work with IndexedDB yourself, so you work with PouchDB, and it just makes everything nicer. And more importantly, it also R-bytes that syncing to the remote server. So it gives you persistent storage in the browser, of course, even without authentication. If you use this architecture, you can sync that data between different devices, and it allows you to maintain some local consistency, both by preventing conflicts as well as, when conflicts do occur, by doing your best to manage them. Okay, so moving on to the second part of my talk here, I'm going to show a simple example. Let's open an incognito window. Oh, I guess I should actually run the server. So I'm just opening an incognito window. So this is as if I were visiting the website for the first time. This is a text editor. It's not a very good one. First of all, it's just plain text in a text area. I'm also forcing through the UI several types of interactions that you'd probably want your app to do automatically in normal circumstances. That's just for demo purposes. But what you can see is without a connection or without authenticating really, or having anywhere to store this data, I can save a bunch of different versions of my data. And if I were a different person visiting the application on a different device, I would have, oh, how did that happen? Demos never work when you really do them. Okay, so let's just skip over that. This seems kind of trite, but it's, I think it's really kind of cool because with just a website, you know, a URL that you can share with somebody, somebody can actually go and start using your application without having to sign in or think of a password or click that they've read some terms and conditions, which of course they haven't. So maybe it's just the hippie in me, but I think that the ability for users to have their own data on their own machine and use your application without having to store their data on your server is really pretty cool. But of course, eventually, you would want them and they would want to be able to sync their data between different devices. And so just to make this really visceral, I'm going to get two different browsers. Oh, that's my incognito window. Two different browsers open to the same document side by side. Let's just make sure this is really the current version of the data. Oh, hey, it worked. Okay. So let's say one person is using this application on their phone as well as on a different machine, and fix some of the quotes in here maybe. And if I save that, hey, it's synced to the other window without us having to do anything, even refresh the page. So if you've ever thought about syncing or tried to implement syncing, this is really hard to do. I think it's really cool that Pouch does it for us anyway. The next thing I think I was going to move on to was sort of talking about what to do with conflicting data and how to manage conflicts. But before I get there, can I just pause and ask if anybody has any questions so far? Okay, good. All right, so this is the Walrus and the Carpenter from Alice Through the Looking Glass. Probably some of you recognize it, but we forgot to put any sort of attribution in here. So let me put in the name Lewis Carroll, and let's say the other user who's working on a different device is going to use Lewis Carroll's real name, which I had to write down here because nobody is going to remember that, and that is Charles Lutwidge Dodgson. So now we have potentially a conflict situation because the users are trying to enter different data. So the way that Couch and Pouch manage conflicts is via this rev. And you can think of this as like a unique identifier for a particular state of the document at any one time. So when you want to update data in Pouch, you need to not only provide the idea of the document that you're updating, which is kind of obvious, but also this rev number. And so what that does is it ensures that the user is seeing the latest version of the document. They're not updating data when they don't know its current state, and so they're not obliterating anything, and at the same time they're not introducing a conflict in the data if they don't mean to. I'm going to save this on one side, and you'll notice, unlike before, it doesn't actually update yet on the other side, and that's intentionally, programmatically on my part. I'm not bringing anything to the UI if the user has already changed something in order to not sort of wipe out their data. So if the user on this side now tries to save the document, you'll get this, again, bad UI, which just informs them that they have a conflict while attempting to save. Of course, you wouldn't want to show a modal like this in real life. Maybe you could show a diff. Maybe you could rebase the changes or try to merge them so that the user doesn't even have to think about it. But basically, the point is that when you try to save and don't have the current version of the data, Pouch is going to throw an error at you, and you can catch that and manage it sort of however you want. So in this case, let's go to Lewis Carroll, and it'll update now on this side as well. OK, so one other thing. I'm going to pretend that my Chrome user is offline. And in this case, I'm not going to be able to prevent the conflict because the two users won't even be aware that the other document has been modified in the meantime. And this, again, comes down to those revs. So before I do this, actually, let me collect the Mad Libs if they're floating around the room. Who's got the other ones? Thanks. So we have 3 different documents. They all started off the same with just one rev at the very beginning, and they've been going around the room and being modified. So if I'm now one database node and I've got these 3, they would now be considered conflicts. The way that I initially decide which one is the right one is to just compare those revs with each other, and whichever one is alphanumerically the greatest is the one that wins. And that's a pretty good system because we put that integer at the beginning, which always increases. Initially, whichever one has been written to the most times is the one that wins. And so I'm just going to scan this and make sure I can actually read it out loud. OK. So all year long, the North Saskatchewan is wintry and cold, and big wet cornflakes fall from the sky. Sometimes I need a break to warm my hands. That's why Mrs. Claus and I go on a spicy summer vacation each year. This year, we hopped in a Rolls-Royce and traveled to sunny California. We stayed in a 4-star hut right on the beach. We took surfing lessons and learned to hang 8 while yelling blank exclamation. We swam in the ocean with dinosaurs. We ate local shrimp, relaxed, read books about elephants, and let the sun shine on our heel. It was just what the elves ordered. We came home to, I can't tell what that says, Calipigeon. To the Calipigeon pole, feeling rested and rejuvenated, ready to face the Reaper and get back to work. After all, Christmas is just around the blank. OK. So normally, I've got all 3 versions of the conflict, but I can only kind of, if I call the database and ask for this document, initially I'm only going to get the one that wins according to that algorithm, and that's just so that I can sort of keep working with it. But Pouch and Couch will actually store both versions for as long as you need them to, and when you want to, you can resolve them by a different algorithm however you want, and just then write to that canonical document in order to update it with the data that you actually like. So am I offline here? OK. So when Lewis Carroll wrote this poem, he left it up to his illustrator to decide what the walrus would be. And he picked 3 different things that all fit with the meteor, and the illustrator presumably just chose which one was the easiest to draw. OK, so initially nothing happens. They both save just fine. The revs increased on both sides. And now I'm going to bring this back online, and they will sync. And again, nothing happened except that I can look for that conflict and Pouch knows that it's there. And once again, even though one of the users was offline for who knows how long, I'm able to deal with this and just keep the revision that I want and discard the other one. All right, so finally, hopefully I've convinced at least a few of you that this is all kind of cool, but my usual sort of full transparency slide about what some of the downsides are and why you might not want to write your next app with this architecture. There's this famous quote that people use to promote Couch as well as Pouch, which is that CouchDB is bad at everything except syncing. And then it sort of goes on to explain why syncing is the hardest part and also the most important part, and so you should probably just ignore all the bad sides and use it anyway. So what do I mean by that? It doesn't sort of work the same way as other database technologies, especially SQL-like databases. There are some things you just sort of can't do with Couch that seem like they should be pretty easy if you're used to using relational databases. Another thing is you run into problems with a Pouch-based app in terms of data that's shared between users, because you're actually pulling down all of a user's data into their local browser where they can work with it. So there's no ability to like restrict their write access or anything like that. Once they have access to a document, they're able to do anything with it. And of course, that's a completely different story if you have a server-side application where your server can kind of act as a gatekeeper for any sort of operations that the user is able to do. Databases tend to balloon in size. This is especially a problem on mobile. The reason for this is that because of the syncing algorithm, you can never actually delete anything. If you delete something, your database still needs a way to communicate with the other databases in the network that that has happened. So that can be kind of a problem because eventually the browser will run out of space if it's really if there's really a lot of data for it to work with. Couch actually will eventually purge old documents. That was just never implemented in Pouch. And sort of related to what I was saying before, complex and relational queries are a bit of a headache. But finally, just to show you that this isn't something that's only useful for toy projects, this is what I'm currently working on. I'm a freelancer, but I'm working mainly with Adapon Incorporated, which is in the scientific publishing industry. And we just released this text editor for academic documents. So this is a little bit like Google Docs or something like that, but it's specifically targeted at periodicals. You can add equations, you can add code, it will manage your bibliography for you. And a lot of academic papers have like a lot of authors in particle physics. Sometimes it's like hundreds. And so this concurrency is a really important part of the application for us and the reason that we chose to build it with PouchDB. But if you're a student or a professor maybe, there's a couple of you in the room I think, check this out. We just released this month and we're going to be complementing the web app with a Mac app pretty soon as well. All right, so that's really all I've had to say. I didn't show any code at all. That was intentional. If you want to look at the code, you can find it on my GitHub. Hopefully the README is also detailed enough you'd be able to run that demo yourself as well if you want, and I'll just leave my info up here and take any last questions. Thanks. Yeah, Ben.
One of the ideas I played around with Pouch is again, Pouch is bad at everything except syncing.
Yeah.
Is an idea of like using Pouch for certain parts of the application and then
Yeah.
additional relational database. Like if you played around with that, is that something?
Yeah, I mean, our app doesn't use, the manuscripts app I showed at the very end doesn't use entirely Pouch. We have GraphQL in there as well. And of course, you know, every application at scale is going to use lots of different kinds of data. The major way I think to get around like users being able to share data is that you can, because your couch data is there on a server, you can also build like a regular API wrapped around it. So there's no reason you need to limit yourself just to the pouch way of working with things. Yeah, Ryan.
Just to tag along to that, in a lot of applications we do with Couch and PouchDB, because it keeps track of all the changes, you can build indexes in other systems like Elasticsearch or SQL
Right.
things
Yeah.
building off of your Couch changes. So if you wanted to like augment the sync with search and stuff like that, it's really easy to do.
Yep.
As far as when conflicts occur, is there anything within Pouch or any like utility libraries and such that help with resolving, like doing diffs and stuff?
Not really, because how you, yeah, I mean, in terms of UI libraries,
What kind of things do you do for your document editor, like your professional?
yeah, so what we've got is the editor is actually based on Prose Mirror. And so what you can do with Prose Mirror is like search for where the conflict starts in the text and where it ends, and then show sort of a diff. So Prose Mirror allows you to add decorators and all kinds of interesting things like that. But how you're going to resolve the conflict, especially at the UI level, is so intrinsic to the thing itself that I don't think there's like a generic solution that I can think of that would really satisfy that. I was going to say one other thing, but it completely slipped my mind. Depending on, so for some kinds of data, conflicts might not be a problem at all. It only matters if the update depends on the previous value. So like if it's somebody's phone number, who cares, right? You can just overwrite it and like call to get the current value and then provide that rev and just obliterate it. That's fine. Yeah. Yeah, so if you never update data, then of course you don't ever have to worry about it. So like Twitter, like you can't change your tweet once you tweet it, right? All right, thank you.
Cool.